So prior to that, in your 20s, you were bulimic. And that's sort of inspired the You Can Beat the Binge book. 20s, that's a bit old. For bulimia, sorry.
Well, funnily enough,
Did it start in
no.
the 20s?
It started when I was 19, but I mean it came with a lot of other things too. It was sort of when I got to university, and I was an alcoholic and I was bulimic, and I smoked 4 packets of cigarettes a day. I became just an out of control. I mean, I had a lot of demons.
Yeah.
And I suppose the main thing back then was that no one really seemed to know what it was. It didn't. People were just starting to recognise anorexia, and I did have anorexia and bulimia. I used to. You can have the two together because you used to starve yourself for most of the time, and then when you eat, you binge. So you know the two can go hand in hand. But bulimia didn't have a name, and I remember I really believed I was the only person in the world who actually thought of being that disgusting, and it's a very sort of shameful thing, I felt. And eventually, I couldn't talk to anyone about it, and eventually I plucked up courage to approach an agony aunt. I wrote to an agony aunt, and she wrote back and told me to stop being so vain. So that was, as far as I was concerned, that was the end of trying to seek any kind of treatment. It just made me feel that,
Feel worse.
Yeah.
So just to differentiate, anorexia is not eating.
Yeah.
Whereas bulimia is eating
binging
and then making
and
yourself
purging,
vomit or taking laxatives.
Or taking laxatives.
To speed the food. And of course there's that other thing that you're not getting nutrients then.
Well, that's right. It's funny because it occurred to me just a few years ago that it was actually being an alcoholic that kept me alive, because the only calories I was getting was from alcohol. And I used to think to myself, isn't it odd that alcohol is the one thing that doesn't make any difference to my weight? Yeah. But I realise now that there was nothing else to make any difference to my weight, because I'd never had any food to absorb. Yeah. I used to drink Bloody Marys because I thought that tomato juice would be a bit sort of nutritious and give me a bit of vitamin C. So. But I think in terms of calories, it must have been the alcohol that sort of kept me going.
Right. So that was.
I'm not promoting alcoholism, by the way.
No, that's we need to make that clear. So you.
No,
it was just in your 20s. By the time you were 30, it was over.
Well, not really. I mean, my 20s were awful. I was. I mean, as you can imagine, I was suicidally depressed. Yeah. And then when bizarrely, I got married to someone I'd known for 6 weeks. Yeah. And I used to say, I'd only known him for 6 weeks, but then it occurred to me that it's probably the fact that he'd only known me for 6 weeks that we got married. Because I must have appeared to be quite well behaved while we were first together. But then I'd been told that I couldn't have children because of my eating disorders. And I was also taking the pill because I was terrified. I couldn't even look after myself. So, the idea of being pregnant frightened the life out of me. Mm. But then I found I was. I mean, it was just absolutely bizarre. And at first I had no idea how I'd be able to cope. And I didn't think I would be able to cope. Mm. But I found that being responsible for another life actually... It gave me the strength to behave myself better, if you like. I felt the responsibility for it. I thought, even if I can't cope when he's born, at least I can look after him while, I'm totally responsible for him. So I stopped drinking and smoking, and my eating was still a bit iffy, but much better. I was, I was very intent on retaining nutrients. Yeah. And so after he was born, obviously I was absolutely in love with him, and continued to behave reasonably well. I sometimes think that the reason I ended up having 4 children was because it was a sort of self-control, a form of imposed self-control. Right. Don't tell them that. in a lovely, loving way. But really, I was still just keeping a lid on it. I was still It was
still always there in the background.
Yeah. Particularly the eating. I found it and this is something that sort of began to sort of I began to work out at this time was that I could stop smoking, I could stop drinking, I couldn't stop eating.
Oh.
You have to eat,
Yeah.
which means that if you have an issue with eating, and I consider eating that it can be like an addiction,
Yeah.
then it's the hardest of all, I think, because you can never just stop.
Yeah.
So if you do have a problem with eating, it becomes all-encompassing because you spend your life thinking, what am I going to eat next? Am I going to eat too much? Will I be able to stop? What am I going to do if I can't stop? So you get into this appalling circular thinking. And I think that there's a big danger that dieting, even if you don't have the sort of the predisposition to have an eating disorder, I think that dieting can start that sort of cycle where you deprive yourself for a period of time, and then because you've been deprived, you find it almost impossible to control what you do eat, or you're just desperate for something that you really want. And I saw someone once describe it as being like holding your breath, which I think is a really good analogy. It's like you can hold your breath for so long, but only so long. And when you breathe again, you take in huge gulps of air. And I think that can be a similar thing with eating. If you
So
are,
instead of being a steady in, out, it's the
sort of starvation followed by. And I think that's I don't know if you've seen most people who diet end up gaining more weight.
Yes.
And I just think that it's this setting up of this awful cycle. It's a vicious cycle, whether it's an eating disorder or it's a dieting cycle, I think, and they have pretty much the same outcome. So,
yeah. You can find out more about Domini at her website, doministuart.com, no AU.
That's right.
And look out for her books on Amazon if you don't find them on her website. Thank you, Domini.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for asking me.